was a really interesting last few days for sports fans in Chicago to deal with this story of the passing of Bobby Hull. And I think us here on the Sports Cubicle, it is our job if we get to talk about the fun stuff, whether it's the NBA, the Super Bowl, Justin Fields, MLB, all the nerdy stuff, that we have to talk about the important things, good and bad. And I'm so happy that I am proud and thankful I get to do it with the marvelous one, Dan Marver, Devin Tingle, and Paul Chivari. And, I think when you talk about in today's day and age, you have to be fair about situations. And if we're going to talk about the greatness that is Bobby Hull, the nicknames and the legacy of him and Makita and what it meant to that era of hockey and hockey fans into the city, we have to keep it honest of the bad stuff too. And I want to talk to you guys about a guy who was one of the greatest to ever do it, one of the fixtures of sports in our city, who has a horrible past also, being convicted of domestic violence, and how we have to talk about these stories. Nobody's perfect and nobody's able to do this the right way. We can only do it our way, and that's why I'm proud to do it with you guys. So I'm going to start off with Paulie. I mean, you're somebody who you really try to, have empathy, sympathy, and awareness of everything that's going on. You also try your best to acknowledge history and embrace it. And we've done this story so many times, but when the passing happened of Bobby Hull, your thoughts, your kind of emotions, especially over the last few months and years of dealing with the Blackhawks, of this entire story, good and bad.
I spent kind of the last few years just kind of railing on Bobby Hull for his off the ice stuff. I think we all know about the domestic violence and just kind of how lousy of a person he was in that regard. And I've heard mixed things. I've heard some unabashed, just really outdated thoughts. But I've also heard people talk about how nice he was to them, and how there were times where he would give people his time and he just want to hang out. So I spent the last few years talking about how terrible of a person he was. So I guess in this regard, it's all been kind of said this week. There's nothing under the table right now about how terrible of a person he was. But as far as a hockey player, it's ridiculous how good this guy was on the ice. Several years leading the league in goals. I think that like 3 seasons with the Hawks that he led the league in points. All sorts of Lady Byng trophies, Ross trophies, Hart trophies. Winning the Stanley Cup with the Hawks, which was a hard thing to do before the 2010s. So yeah, I mean, it's a legendary career. Clearly, someone that we need to talk about, regardless of how awful of a person he was off the ice. And I think that we need to bring that awareness, though, of maybe not a person that should be a role model in anyone's life, but definitely someone who's changed the game of hockey, was an important part of the storyline of hockey, and at least for his on ice things, deserves to have the number 9 hanging up in the rafters at the United Center. And hopefully people can learn from the off the ice stuff, because it's a violent sport. He played without a helmet. It's a different era, and perhaps some of that off the ice violence might be symptomatic of what happened on the ice.
I think it's the idea of artists and art. Can you separate the two? And I think that's the thing. And I think the only reason we bring this up is because we have to be real, right? I mean, that's the one thing the 4 of us have tried to do the best when it comes to doing this show, is just being honest with it. Like, nobody's saying anything out of pocket or that isn't true. We're just having the conversation, because this is what happens with people when you get to the age of 83, 84 years old, and you've had that type of life. And Marver, I know this is something that you've seen, the good and the bad. You've read the good and the bad. You've experienced the good and the bad. But knowing you can't even say the checkered history, the acknowledged awful history, but also the impact and the history of the sport. It's a complicated situation, but feel free. This is your time. What did you think about this entire story of the passing of Bobby Hull?
Yeah, well, I watched Bobby Hull in Chicago Stadium with people smoking. It was smoky. My seat was in the balcony. It was in the corner of the balcony where you were closer to the ice and the people below you. But here's the thing. I mean, aside from his personal life, there's a statue outside the United Center of him now, so he's earned that for his performance on the ice. The 50 goal mark was like the Babe Ruth thing for hockey. 50 goals, Maurice Richard, Bernie Geoffrion, and he passed that in 1966 with his 51st goal. So it was kind of like the Babe Ruth thing in the for hockey at that time. So that was quite an accomplishment. And even though there were only 6 teams, when they won the Stanley Cup for the first time in 61 and 23 years, I mean, it was dominated by Montreal mostly and Toronto over those years. But it would seem like they should have gotten more with just 6 teams, but they didn't. But they did get that one in 61, and led mostly by Bobby Hull's great goal scoring. And as a player, it was like he would fly down the ice, blonde hair flying, and is a terrific slap shot, and he hit all the characteristics of a boy, a blonde boy wonder as a youngster. And his passing is sad, and some of his later off the ice exploits mar his image. But I remember more as that blonde boy flying down the ice in the '60s, and when I was a little lad, shall we say.
It's important though, Marvelous, and I'm glad you brought that up because the impact, right? And again, it goes to show it's like we just got to be honest with ourselves. Everything on the table, and I think it's great to be able to say it's like this dude was special on the ice, and he also did these things. Both things can be true simultaneously, and I think it's great to have the knowledge and be able to have the source of somebody like you who saw in the prime, in arguably the coolest stadium, in one of the most important franchises in all of sports. So, it just goes so interesting. And Devin, you hear the story, you read the story, you know the old heads talk about him, how the new generation, how the organization, the old man, how he felt about him, and how this organization tried to embrace and all the blemishes and all the gross, but all the greatness. I mean, this entire story, it's complicated, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked about this in a lot of situations where we try to separate the athlete or the artist from the person. And there's certain cases that's just too hard to do here for some of the crimes they've done or what they've done the time here. And I mean, I'm glad we have someone like Marver here to bring it up. It's like, because for you, myself, and Paul, we didn't see Bobby Hull growing up. We don't have that emotional connection of seeing that, whereas Marver does, where it's like, it's a little bit hard to separate the man from the athlete there, where for us, it's so easy to be like, no, you're a POS for what you did there. And I mean, it is one of those things where it's like, I do think history is something you got to learn from here. And again, no one's brought up, is it possible he has some CTE or some possible, brain damage from, not wearing the helmet and clonked around? Because they've realized a lot of these guys in all sports had like brains of like 80-year-olds with autism, Alzheimer's. Thank you. And like, they're like mid to like, late 40s. It's really just tragic there. I mean, we've definitely learned a lot there, as I can't think of a sport that, has heavy contact where they're not wearing helmets or something to protect their noggin. But it is just one of those things that for his contribution to the Hawks, Bobby Hull, great. His number deserves there. And I remember reading a book about the Blackhawks in elementary school. He actually broke the curse of the Blackhawks, by the way, guys, by winning that Stanley Cup. So the 2004 Red Sox, they can shut the hell up about the curse fans. There's another team that broke their curse long before them. But I'm sorry,
No, I'm glad you guys brought up the CTE, Paulie. You kind of circled it first, and Paul and Devin kind of bringing it back home, how important it is to just know, right? Like how different the science and the community. And we we had a great conversation that you're going to be able to check out next week here on WCPT. But if you go onto the YouTube channel or at Mercado Airwaves Network or wherever, all of our social medias, we actually talked to Chicago Steel, the awesome hockey organization, over with President Dan Lev. And we talked about kind of the impact of the Blackhawks and what they've done and kind of the image, right? And I don't want to end it on a dour note, but let's keep it all honest. We know what happened with Bobby Hull. We saw what happened with the old man. We now see what's happening with Rocky, and we saw what happened with Patrick Kane. This is an organization that has had a hard time keeping its big name stars away from trouble, other than Jonathan Toews, and even then, during the whole COVID situation was a little weird. So I think there is something to this idea of like that sport changes a dude after playing it since he was 7 years old. And with that in mind, I think it's important, and I think it's okay to acknowledge the greatness and acknowledge the blemishes, no matter how severe or how little, but as severe in this case or as little as jaywalking. The idea is we got to be honest about the situation, and our fans deserve it. Our audience deserves it. We can't sugarfoot around the idea of who this person is. And guess what? God forbid, the day Michael Jordan leaves us, we're going to have to be honest about Michael, about a lot of different things. That's what happens with our big name celebrities, the people we've put into those pedestals. And I hope over time, these generations younger than us are better than us, that they see these people as just people. But we only have about a minute left here on this topic. I know it's something that we'll be talking about. The city is losing its legends every single year. Cub fans, White Sox fans have seen it, and it's only going to get worse as time goes on. And I think it's just something we have to prepare for. But we have a minute left. Paul, any final thoughts on the passing of Bobby Hall?
It's officially an end of an era, because I can't think of too many people that are still around from the 1960s and 70s Blackhawks. So kind of puts that era to rest. And I think, I've been kind of going on about how the Blackhawks really need to take a hard look in the mirror about how this organization wants to present themselves. And I think whether they wanted to or not, this kind of wipes the slate clean a little bit in terms of they're not trotting him out anymore as an ambassador for the team, or having the living legend there with them. It's a bygone era now. So another chance for the Blackhawks to take a hard look in the mirror and decide how they want to go forward as an organization.
Dev, final thoughts?
I'll take classic quote of heroes are remembered, but legends never die, because Bobby Hall is no hero. But when it comes to hockey, he's an absolute legend. I mean, you can't take away those accomplishments. You can't take those accomplishments away from him just what he did off there. It is the separation of the two, but it's like I'm torn, Mercado. That's just my best way to say it. I'm kind of torn here.
Marvelous. You saw the man. You know the legend. Your final thoughts on the passing of Bobby Hall?
Obviously, when somebody gets to a certain age, it's inevitable. But in his case, it's the end of that era. And I was just thinking about that era too. Not only did not have helmets, the goalies did not have masks. Thinking of Glenn Hall, I can name them. They only had 5 other goalies in the league: Sawchuk, Bauer, Jacquemin, and Worsley. I knew all the players because there were so few teams. But be that as it may, it's the end of that era, and so on we go, and time passes, and nobody lasts forever, good, bad, or indifferent, and so that's my thought on that situation.
100%. We're glad that we could get that perspective too. It's invaluable when you're talking to 3 dummies like us. I have somebody that actually saw history, so it's really appreciated here. And I think my final thoughts are: be better people. No matter how great you are at your job, just try to be the best person you can be. And if you can't, learn from others' mistakes. Let's not repeat them, please. So I think that was really important, because Devin, we had a conversation for all the hockey fans who are listening. We had a conversation that will be airing next week on the radio station, but can be found on socials as of Friday. What we talk about grooming and making sure that our young men and women are awesome to society and our community. Who do we talk to with? Who do we talk with? Who do we have on the show that the awesome people can listen to?
Oh, Dan Lev, president of Chicago Steel, and I don't know my notes here, but he's a 2-time award winner of some Executive of the Year award. Wish I had my notes by next week. Yeah, you can catch that next week, and if you listen to the podcast of this, it'll actually be on right after our show kind of goes there. So a little bit of a treat for those, those few people like to listen to the podcast. The people like to sleep at 9 o'clock at night on a Sunday, as opposed to partying with the Sports Cubicle.
We're on Twitter at Sports Cubicle TV. It's Paulie. He's Paul Chivari. It's Devin. It's Devin Tingle. It's the marvelous one. It's Dan Marver. I'm Mike Mercado.